I think you gotta put your little oxygen mask on first. And you would only do that if you believe that you being the best version of yourself will then be able to go have manifold more impact and compounding impact than a short sprint, right? Where you're not caring for yourself.
Welcome back to another episode of Good Work. I'm your host, Barrett Brooks, and this is a show made up of long-form interviews with talented people using their careers to make the world a better place. My guest on today's show is Sophie Purdom. I followed Sophie's work for a long time because I got really interested in using my career to reverse climate change. In that process, I started researching climate tech companies, which is a field of companies working to reverse climate change as a global problem, but in very specific verticals and in very minuscule problems. Things like building small nuclear reactors or transforming solar power, storing power in batteries, mining minerals that are going to be needed for the energy transition, making electric cars, or even smaller day-to-day things like carbon credits for individuals and companies or making home goods more sustainable. It's a wide field with many different ways of looking at it, and Sophie's one of the experts on it. She's the co-founder of a publication called Climate Tech VC, which started as one of many climate tech publications early on in the pandemic and became the preeminent place to go for investors, founders, and everyone interested in climate tech as a burgeoning industry. Sophie's now gone on to found a fund called Planeteer Capital, where she's funding early stage and growth stage companies who are working to combat the climate crisis. We had a wide-ranging conversation as usual on a variety of topics, but especially focused on her journey into battling climate change with her career, where her optimism comes from, and all of the ways that she looks at solving climate change through capitalism and building companies. So please enjoy my conversation with Sophie Purdom. Let's get to it. Well, Sophie, welcome to the show. I've been looking forward to this for a while.
We're doing it.
We're doing it.
Likewise.
Yep. I always like to try and pick maybe the most interesting place I could find to start these conversations. And what I came up with for you was you told the story on, I think, just one podcast about finding some roadkill on the side of the road and running an experiment with beetles to see what happens and to see if you could get a clean skeleton out the other side. And I wondered if you could just share, not necessarily an in-depth review of the science of that, but maybe like how the interest in that kind of thing came to be.
You dug deep. You weren't kidding. It's true. I did, once upon a time, preserve these animal skeletons with domestic beetles. It was all approved. Got a permit from the police. Not to worry. Maybe not to worry too much. And I was with a really cool early believer in a teacher that shared same interests that I did and encouraged me along the way, which is like a totally magical thing to have happen to a high schooler. I just feel so lucky. There were a handful of people that really leaned in on the same passions that I did pretty early for me. And there's a ton to take away from that. I think maybe one of the things that was extra lucky for me in particular is that this climate space, or what we would now call the climate space, was very niche. The nerds that took environmental studies classes in high school, it was a tiny, tiny room. The textbooks were very fresh because no one bothered to open them. There's like real shared spirit, I suppose, of folks that were interested enough to go and do that kind of gross, dirty work. And that lined up perfectly well with my personal evolution and kind of life timelines, right? So that something that I've long been passionate about and have been working pretty hard on for a while now also lines up with the timelines of other folks. So there's a lot of luck to be had in that, but can confirm it's true. I did mess with roadkill.
I love the story. Well, number one, because it's interesting and I found it unique. And number two, you kind of like excused it in the story you told it originally, and you excuse it a little bit now. But what I love about it is it reflects this curiosity and just like fascination with the natural world and what's going on there, and like understanding what animals are and like had this role of the beetles and everything else. Or that's how I imagine it anyways. It relates back to how you talk about the early part of your story, growing up in rural England and really being connected to nature and spending a lot of time in nature. And, we both have business backgrounds. And I think one of the things that you're probably world class at, if not on the path to world class, is communicating to business people about topics that they often don't want to think about in terms of climate and nature and the environment. And you've made it a core skill set to speak business language about these causes that matter to you. But it's also rooted in this like childlike sense of wonder about nature and animals and the natural world around us. And so I wondered if you might just kind of take us back to those early years in England and what it was like to form those early bonds with the natural world.
I think curiosity is right, and as a thread running through all of that, I also think life can be pretty boring if you don't focus on the spiky people. I love spiky people. I like people who are interested in something. It doesn't have to be the same things that I'm interested in. Fathom a guess that most people think that's super strange to do the domestic beetle experiment, right? The group of folks that I and my partner and my business associates kind of walk through life with, they're generally just interested. And that makes for super, I guess I'm going to say interesting, but engaging, strongly worded, educational conversation and debate. And maybe this is going a step too far, but I think that's kind of really what it's all about, right? So it's unique, I suppose, that my thread or the thing that I've been interested in, climate, environmental systems thinking more broadly, why the heck people make the decisions and do the things that they do, and how that impacts resource use, mostly from a business perspective. That just happens to have lined up with kind of some of the overlying thematic threads of the past, let's call it kind of like 15 years of business. That's lucky. But I think I'd probably be doing this anyway, to be totally honest. I like being able to connect different languages together. And I love to play that privileged, enabling, orchestrating role. I try to not wear the hat just of the cheerleader. It's more of the analyst and the orchestrator, and not being afraid to put those two things together and have those complex discussions and then synthesize and then put it in the words of how other people can succeed as a result of kind of understanding that opportunity or kind of challenge area. That's a weird mashup of life experiences coming from a very different culture into kind of New England from, I guess, old England. I might pass as pretty American at this point, and I certainly feel very Americanized by choice. But that's not how I spent my, pre-college kind of days. I think kind of like a scientist, but I maybe communicate more like a blogger or a writer. I trained at Bain, where communicating for results is a 3-letter acronym that, you like jot down in your notebook. But yet now I kind of trade, right? And like make investment decisions. And that's kind of much more quantitative. So it's a funky mashup of all of these different pieces. And that's the community that I walk in. And yeah, I don't know, take what you want from kind of that.
No, I love it. It's one of the things that makes me interested in, or made me interested originally in you and Kim's work at Climate Tech VC, which was the newsletter that you all ran together for a long time. And now you all have kind of slightly separated in your work, although you're still very attached.
I'd say we're doing it better than ever. So CTVC is still gunning. We just have more folks around the table, which has been amazing, right? Talking about like gathering those like more perspectives and those more interested people. So CTVC is not going anywhere.
Yeah, for sure. I think y'all have almost like you've found ways that equally match where you each want to move towards to build on top of the work that you originally started. You with Planeteer Capital, and Kim is now running Sightline behind as the kind of data platform behind CTVC, which, in some ways, it's like you all did the heavy lifting to manually track everything about an ecosystem for years, and now have built that into a product because you cared so much, which I think is incredible. And it brings together all of these things of like this innate emotional passion for the work, but also thinking like a scientist, thinking like a banker, thinking like a capitalist. And so often those things are bifurcated. It's like you have capitalists and you have environmentalists. And I think we have a growing cadre of peers and people who are saying, well, actually, what if we did both and we made those things aligned? And I think that's one of the great gifts y'all have given the ecosystem, is to say, it's not capitalism or the climate, it's capitalism and the climate. And how can we make those things aligned? And I wonder how you think about that now, of aligning the existing economic system we have that works well for the global economy with serving climate needs over the long term.
This thesis of climate investing, originally perhaps early derivations of ESG investing. If we take it one step further back, kind of the larger camp of sustainable investing. The one thesis that I want to prove with that broader camp of an approach to investing is by harnessing the disruption and transition opportunity from a risk and kind of an upside perspective through these huge commodity markets, this should be the place to make the most money from a returns perspective, period. It's not catalytic, can be if you want to operate in that side of the world. It's not concessionary. We manage money for some of the biggest, extremely for-profit driven institutions out there who've chosen us side by side with the entire suite of universe of other fund managers. And so I hold that deeply, really deeply, which is, it's not quite impact investing. I think that's a really outdated and kind of snoozy term at this point that we can probably put to bed. It's just doing more better and incorporating material value drivers and risk reduction metrics and timing that right. So gone with the catalytic, gone with the concessionary. The thing that I would like to have written on my gravestone alongside some things about me probably as a person is helping prove that this space is the place and point in time right now to drive the most financial value. I've been after that thesis. Perhaps I couldn't articulate it then, but I've been after that since high school. It's just got much more honed, and I learned different languages and different application areas and different asset classes as the industry itself has matured as well.
Yeah, for sure. I know it sounds pedantic, but the idea of impact investing versus investing that has impact is substantial. It's what is the intent? Well, the intent is to make money, but it's to do it while transforming the economy, really, and the underlying sublayers of everything that runs the modern world, and making money doing it, but doing it in a way that becomes more sustainable over time. We definitely share that belief. As I listen to your story and I think back, okay, how did Sophie start to form these ideas, and where did her business sense come from and her investing sense come from? You talk in these short snippets, but in almost every interview you do about the family business and how that shaped the way that you started to almost form an operator's mindset early on, much earlier than most people. And then you also talk about being an immigrant from England and kind of that immigrant's mindset of working hard and really putting effort into everything that you were doing. So I wonder, as you look back now, to your point about being able to articulate things now that you couldn't maybe then. So you look back at the roots of kind of how you became an operator, how you started to form these views. How did running that business and working hard from such an early age shape what you've done now?
I think it's foundationally shaped kind of everything. I'm not the only person that's had an experience like that. I think it's probably more common than not that lots of folks work pretty hard and work on a family business or some version of bringing home money for the family pretty early. Perhaps not in the pretty privileged worlds that we get to operate in now, right? Where folks were lucky enough to get to focus on being a kid or being excellent at sports or, academics or social life or whatnot, and kind of were free of some of those other responsibility sets. I got to do all of those things. And there was an expectation, right, that we worked on this as a family. And that was less a requirement versus it was just never not something that I felt a responsibility to do, and my younger sister. But it was certainly unusual, mostly because we built that whole thing ourselves. I remember when my parents had the idea to start this business, literally around a kitchen table. And the four of us who lived pretty insularly, I'd say, really self-reliant, had everything that we needed, but chose to operate the household kind of independently. So unlike other folks in the normal suburban Massachusetts neighborhood and our neighbors, we would fix everything ourselves to a really high quality bar, I would say. Do everything ourselves, build lots of stuff ourselves, make lots of stuff ourselves, grow lots of stuff ourselves. It's a bit more British, perhaps, but it's also just having a really high quality bar, I think, and really high set of expectations and being the exact opposite of lazy. So you realize you can do a lot if you kind of put all of that stuff in combination. There were things I would have chosen to outsource if I were in charge of the household then, but we didn't. And you learn a lot from that. So apply that same kind of like household economics approach then through to what became the business. So it kind of felt like the household grew, and that became more and more of a partnership, I suppose, or like a working relationship between the four members of the family. We naturally, like in most businesses, start playing to your strengths. I wasn't in charge. My parents worked at it full time. I went to school, but I also worked on it a lot and for many, many, many years, and saw that evolution of that business over time, which was also either very lucky or very cleverly farsighted insofar as working on e-commerce distribution. I'm working on a natural health kind of category, which did well from a consumer perspective. But at the end of the day, that's the kind of opposite of a deep tech type of business and a high leverage business like the founders that I work with now. That's pull yourself up by your bootstraps, invest the family's minimal savings, compound, hold inventory, duke it out in nasty, negotiations with other distribution partners, ride the waves, and do it yourself. I don't know if you can kind of hear it like in my voice a little bit, but I'm so grateful for where I came from, and also learned a ton pretty early about business building and about partnerships. And like in all good lessons, that's not always super rosy, I suppose. And there are ups and downs to that. I think some of those just maybe came a little bit earlier for me in my development. I'm putting those to darn good use now, right? Those directly impact what I'm building at Planeteer. Those directly impact things like how Kim and I thought really hard up front about incentive alignment, and when we were going to try and monetize CTVC, that gave me the courage to leave Bain earlier than maybe certainly my peers did. Gave me the courage to go and try and start another business with people I'd like barely ever met before who also seemed to work really hard. And so, yeah, it shaped me foundationally. I've also tried to unlearn many of those lessons simultaneously. I'm happy to go into some of that as well.
Yeah. No, one of the things that I was thinking about as I read profiles about you and just thought through this journey you've been on is one version of the story is that it's been a very straight line. You knew what mattered to you. You began working on sustainable investing in college. You followed the interests. You've been in climate the whole time. And, it's that whole, like, it's easy to see the line looking backwards. But I think it also does somewhat of a disservice to you and like the hardship of everything that you've been through to get to where you are by saying like, oh yeah, it was this and then that and then that and then that. And it was obvious, because of course it wasn't obvious. So I just wonder, to what degree you spoke to it a little bit about running the business, but like what have been the hardships along the way that have also shaped how you now operate?
It's hardly a straight line. I don't know if I have a perfect metaphor for this, but it's almost as if by running simultaneous deep kind of engagements or projects or jobs or, however serious those threads get, by having simultaneous threads running, you're able to maintain kind of some of the like creative buffer, the insurance, like reallocation of time as those decision points kind of like emerge. So like an example would be, I don't talk now when I'm kind of trying to give the 2-minute summary of what's brought me to this point about all the other vectors that I went after as well that weren't as meaningful. For example, after I stepped away from helping operate Kula Bio, the fertilizer business, venture-backed, company's doing great. I stepped away from that for entirely personal reasons because I wanted to move to New York with my fiance. And I picked up consulting and ran an ESG consultancy, hired some folks into that, had, I don't know how many, 10, 15 kind of like pretty serious customers. We helped IPO a company. We did a lot of cool work, and that taught me a lot of lessons, and it set me up to then be able to go angel invest, because it turns out angel investing is a very expensive habit. And so you kind of need cash to be on a cap table. And I wasn't coming from a place where I had access to cash. So anyway, that's like one enabling thread, but was never going to kind of be the long-term piece. It just goes back to like, be an interested person and like build constantly. And it's fine for a while if those different threads don't perfectly kind of like weave together. You have to be okay to let some of them go. Same with strategies around raising the fund. Same with strategies around hiring people at different kind of like points in time. It's lots of these are time functions. Let me know if you figured out how to hack this, but I see it's fairly impossible to align your timing, market timing, other people's timing perfectly. And only rarely does that click. And so by having multiple of those kind of threads, then you've got multiple shots on goals for where that luck can kind of align. It totally aligned with CTVC, but I think that the little blog that Kim and I were pitter pattering and typing away at during COVID was going to kind of be the thing that hit? Probably not. Almost certainly not. I was doing other stuff at that time as well, but since kind of like wound some of that down. So I don't know. There's that saying of you want to kind of make yourself the type of person that's impervious to bad luck and extra sticky to good luck because, and then you can kind of position yourself into the face of having a lot of opportunities flow past you. I really believe that. So I always want to be just absolutely knocked off my feet by a flood of opportunities and exposure and data points and people and ideas, but make sure that I'm good internally as a person and structurally and kind of the role that I play in my community and society such that I'm impervious-ish to some of the bad stuff that's going to hit, but the luck is stickier.
Yeah. I love that idea. You talking about the paths that you followed and kind of opening them so that, you've got more shots on goal, more opportunities for luck. Reminds me of, there's this guy online named Tim Urban. He writes a site called Wait But Why. He's got this image,
guy
right?
Online. Okay. Yes. Tim.
Many people will have heard of him. Some people won't have. I don't want to make anyone feel dumb for not having heard of him. He kind of became very well known by writing a series about Elon Musk. But the thing I'm thinking about right now is that he's got this image, he's kind of famous for his little stick drawings and things like that. He's got this image of looking back versus looking forward on life. And on one half of the photo are all of these blackened out paths that didn't work out, with the one that did work out as kind of green, and then every other path going forward as still green. And he uses it in this post to talk about, if you're looking backwards and concentrating on everything that you missed out on, that's one way to look at it. And the other way to look at it is, from where you are, all of the opportunities still available to you. And that story you just told reminds me very much of that you're maximizing the opportunities available to you despite the ones that didn't work out in the past.
Here. Same for investing, same for writing, same for climate change mitigation, right? I get a little frustrated, or maybe it just feels too simplified when folks who are, let's take a college student that's looking for inspiration or a potential path forward, and they want to learn about someone they respect, kind of path through life and the decisions that they made. That N of one journey of an individual going through life through their specific circumstances and at that point in time is never replicable. That same individual with the same DNA, if they went and kind of tried to route themselves to the same endpoint, would never be able to match that walk through life again. The world's different. There's something to that, right? Which is align yourself with whatever the flows around you and don't over optimize. This piece definitely gets me going, especially I'm a recovering management consultant, right? We were taught to over optimize on optionality, which I see as kind of accruing these chips, these option tokens that you can hypothetically cash in the hypothetical life game, or maybe the career game to make it simpler, at a point in the future. That has so many assumptions around it. It assumes the game is still operating, that the person that's taking the chips still has the same book that they're trading stuff in with, the exchange rate. And it also assumes that once you're rich in optionality chips, that you're brave enough to even want to play the same game and to push all of those across the table and cash it in one fell swoop. Example of that would be, if you stay one more year in consulting, then you can go be a manager somewhere else rather than a junior manager. And I don't know, that feels so goofy and so simplistic, and you don't know where the path kind of forks until you're playing the next game. I don't know. I'm all for cashing the chips in and going and kind of figuring out how to play the next game and layering those skills and those learnings on top of one another. But yeah.
That resonates deeply with me and aligns to my experience that you can't guarantee the outcome of the risk of the courage, that courageous act of whatever it is, you leaving Bain or you being willing to take a
well,
shot.
Let's hope it's a bit more courageous than just leaving.
Sure,
Bain, but yeah, we can.
But I mean, in that moment, that moment, it probably felt like a massive thing to your life, right? To leave this short path. And
it did.
So I think about the courage that it takes, even if it's a little bit of courage, to turn in the 2 weeks notice or to even just start a thing that might make you look stupid on the internet, like the origins of CTVC, and not being able to guarantee it, but guaranteeing that if you don't have little moments of courage, you're definitely not going to do a damn thing. And
100%.
As I reflect on my own life, it's like some stuff's paid off and some stuff put me in a pretty bad spot and I had to dig out, and that's just the way it goes. It's like, yeah, you maximize your opportunities, but you also have to have those courageous moments of exposing yourself to them.
Yep. And if you don't do those incremental points of bravery or exposure or whatever, making yourself more sticky to luck, then it will feel terrifying of when you've hoarded all the chips and then you're going to make that one move. The bar will feel so high, right? Imagine if taking the first step with CTVC like way more seriously. And instead of, and I credit Kim with this very much. Kim's much more of she's probably braver than I am. She drives to execution more. I think a lot and try to over-optimize delivery. And Kim's gutsy and productive and drives to execution. And that makes for a really nice combo. And so Kim wrote the first few blog posts. Kim picked the name. Is that a perfect name? Absolutely not. Everybody thinks that we're called like CCTV, like the camera, but we named the thing. It was out in the ether, it existed. And then from there, you kind of start to take those little acts. So I'm not sure. Some combination of like drive to action, perfect is the enemy of the good, expose yourself up to opportunities or nothing's ever going to come knocking on your door asking you to do the thing. But then it's really like what happens once you've gotten started, right? It's less that there's one perfect first step. Ideally, you're kind of putting a lot of feelers out into the world simultaneously. And then when you start feeling that bite from the market, then it's time to start building the scaffolding and the systems like around that. And I think that's probably the bigger lesson or repeatable thing that I've tried to do, which is rarely will it be go build a breakthrough net new science technology. Ironically, now I like to invest in some of that stuff. I like to tinker and then build systems around it and kind of be able to layer these different business model approaches together. That served me pretty well. But it's always making other people look good around you. And therefore, they help pull you through and pull you forward. Be that in setting up the Sustainable Investing Fund back at the university endowment, be that in high school, saving enough money through an energy reduction program to hire new teachers. No one's going to say no to that. On and on. It's like, how do you identify the gatekeepers or the kind of like key enablers in the ecosystem? And by you benefiting them, then it only makes sense for them to kind of bring you into their camp. And you can just do so much more together that way, which is quite antithetical to how much of the broader kind of environmental movement often works, which I perceive, or at least I certainly did in college, to be much more antagonistic. Us versus you, like you versus them, much more on the kind of like disruption versus transition side. Let's take a specific personal example. And I've long said this, there's no doubt that there wouldn't have even been a conversation to be had in the specific environment that I was lucky enough to help to go build a fund within around sustainable investing, around ESG, if there weren't really brave folks that were out on campus for years before kind of rallying for divestment. And so I hope that I'm not just the beneficiary of the work of those folks that are gutsy enough to go be a part of the disruption conversation, but there's also a pragmatic part of it, which is very little gets done if without partnership. And again, like that perfect is the enemy of the good kind of aspect is also a recurring theme. Yeah.
Yeah. And definitely in the environmental movement, it can sometimes be the opposite. But to avoid going down that path, what I'll bring it back to is just the concept of incentive alignment. And I think that you've exercised over and over proper incentive alignment between the change that you're trying to make, the incentives that you're putting in place, and the work that you're trying to do, so that partnerships make sense for everyone. And it's just way easier to move that way when everyone has incentives that are in their own interest to get it done. The other comment I wanted to make was going back to the hoarding of chips thing and how easy it is as life goes on and risks pile up and responsibilities pile up, how easy it is to just put the chips away and not even look at them anymore. And I think that one of the things that I'm taking away that I just want to share out loud for anyone listening, if they didn't pick up on it, is the practice of small acts of courage over time and the practice of using the chips little by little gives you the ability to resiliently continue to do that over time. And it will only get harder the longer you wait to do it. It'd be like starting as an investor and with a $250,000 fund of your own, saying, I'm going to go make one $250,000 investment in like a Series A instead of 10 at 25,000 or 5 times that at 5,000, just to get the reps in and understand the risk taking and all of that. You're almost guaranteeing that you will prove yourself right, that you were supposed to be scared of the risk if you do it that way. And so I just want to like really bring that home, that the taking of small risks over time trains you to take bigger and bigger ones with the appropriate calculus as you age and as you go through your career.
Let's keep running with that example, right? Say you're doing the 10K checks. Good odds, once you get started, very unlikely your first check is going to return the fund. But maybe you make a friend, and maybe that person pulls you into another network that you might not have been a part of. And it kind of starts to snowball and snowball from there. Founder from your first check introduces you to your, whatever it is, 5th check, and your 5th check is the one that really kind of spikes. So, I mean, that's a very practical example, and also kind of metaphorical as well, which is this compounding piece, this like exposure piece, and also this aspect of probably the number one piece of advice that I give when folks are like, oh, I'm thinking about how do I enter this field? How do I break into venture? The only way I think that works is by giving first, and giving for a long time, and not trying to be selfish about it. You can always be incentive aligned, but you can't be selfish about it. And so this concept of you apply to a job and therefore you're owed a job back because you bothered to apply, like that doesn't resonate with me at all. Versus how do you identify someone that you want to learn from and then learn so much about them because the internet exists to be able to proactively go and make their life better. Maybe you source them deals without being asked, right? Maybe you promote their content somewhere. Maybe you help them hire some other talent. I have no idea. On and on and on. The opportunities are pretty endless. That's doing the job anyway. You know, this like concept of breaking in. Someone told me this a long, long time ago and I still really don't super identify as a venture investor. I think I identify more as like a builder, but the only way that you really break into venture is by already going and doing the thing. There's no congratulatory moment where you get appointed or anointed into the field. You earn your way in. And once you're in, then that aspect of the job of continuing to do good for other people while taking your own, for sure, but building the pie, building the network, building the space, and giving, such that folks then kind of come back to you. I think that's beautiful. It's certainly like a strong part of the culture here in climate tech. It's certainly a strong part of like the best parts of the venture ecosystem. It's collaborative while the incentives are aligned for everybody to do better together.
Yeah, that's so good. I mean, there's a million gems in there, but this idea of slowly building relationships over time and giving, not from a place of self-sacrifice, but from a place of generative, collaborative, shared interest, basically.
100%.
I mean, I even think about, we had not met at all, and I had just been following CTVC forever, and I was getting into the climate space, and I dropped you a note on Twitter, and I was like, hey, I made this book, can I send you a copy? And you got back to me, and then a year later, I finally sent it because I had a kid. But it's just I had nothing to be gained from that. I wasn't making money from the book. I wasn't doing anything. It was just like, hey, you're in the space. I made a book. Maybe you'll like it. Let me know. Not to toot my own horn, but I guess we share that in common, that I believe in doing that kind of thing because, yeah, who the hell knows? It's now I'm starting a podcast and, hey, Sophie, do you want to come on? And it's a much easier thing than if I were a completely unknown quantity, but I didn't know that. when I said, hey, do you want a book? So there are these like seed planting efforts along the way that is also easy to get away from the more you achieve and the more that you do over time. It's like, oh, don't forget what allowed this to happen
That's true.
along the way.
That's so true. And also because they're non-linear, right? Because those moments or those actions are non-linear, they're often extremely lateral of there might be a year gap between us talking, or you might make someone feel really good. You answer their question at an event. I don't know, something like that. That person's going to remember you for forever, and hopefully in a good way. And that stuff just all circles back around. I'm a fast moving, pretty impatient, go-gettery vibe. I burn a lot of calories, like gesturing all day and getting really excited about stuff. It took me ages to realize just how incredibly long many of these feedback cycles are, and also just how incredibly resilient network is. To tie it back to what we were talking about at the beginning of this podcast, you're nudging me to talk a bit more about, some of the dynamics of the family business. I respect building that business with my family. One thing that we didn't invest in was any version of network. There are people on the internet shipping stuff out on the internet. And it felt like every kind of, engagement with Amazon or any other distribution partnership that wasn't a partnership. That was a channel. Super duper different from probably just like this ethos that I was maybe born with. My understanding is I've kind of like always been a bit like this, but it doesn't have to be linear for me. And I think I've got like 100% hit rate on being so lovely, pleased and surprised of how that stuff comes back to support you in the long run. I think most people are inherently pretty good. And I think most people are inherently want to be a part of something that feels good and is exciting and that they can learn alongside. We built CTVC with a team of 50 or so volunteers over years and years and years. We didn't make money, so there's no money to give out. We could just give opportunities and exposure and share the brand. The brand has always been CTVC. It's never been Sophie and Kim's blog. Only, I'd say in the past maybe 6 months or so, have people started really kind of talking about the people behind the business. And that's because there's now a business and there's now a fund. And so it's important to talk about the people behind those two things. But CTVC has just been everybody pouring their heart and soul into that shared brand with a belief that, of course, that will come back around and benefit everybody because we're kind of stronger together. So anyway, I hadn't really made that connection before, I guess, between, I'm not sure if it's a anti-British kind of like sentiment and reaction and whatnot, but I deeply believe in that network effect.
Yeah, I think very much that you all have been community builders. Even just in the story you just shared, it's like you're talking about these little acts of connection, the events that you do where you're a speaker or a host or whatever it might be, the 50 people you invited in to be along for the journey with you. And every one of those things, those are human lives. Like those people are all going on their own trajectories, and who knows where they'll end up. So I was going to ask you about community building, but I think in a way you've answered that. You've answered the philosophy behind how you go about building these relationships and the unexpected ways in which they pay off, the nonlinear ways in which they pay off, because you're not trying to make it linear, which I think is an important philosophical difference.
And you can tell right away when someone's trying to make it linear. Maybe sometimes it's hard to put into words, but I don't know about you. I feel it immediately. And sometimes I'll play along because it behooves me, but it feels really different. Of course, there are people like that in this like broader climate space, but they sit in like a little corner. That means they come to fewer things, and they get fewer, invitations, and they're not the immediate ones that I call up unless we both explicitly benefit from it, and then we can play together. This is a pretty special space in that there's a lot of folks that lead kind of giving and community first. If we just like play this out, practically speaking, right? Like that simpatico kind of like aspect of it, that can't last for forever, unfortunately. And so I'm kind of like reveling in it a little bit now. Now the community feels very, very different than it did in 2020, which feels entirely like a different life from 2012. And so the culture will continue to shift. But right now it feels both like effective, large, diverse, collaborative. I don't know. That's a bit of a nothing burger rather than just like it feels so nice.
Well, here's what I'll reflect back that I hear in that is, number one, I want to go back to the point that you made about people are inherently good. I will agree with that and build on that. I think people, even who act badly, have an inclination towards wanting to be good. And so, when we call on that aspect of people, I think they tend to respond. Whereas when we call on the negative aspects of people, I think they tend to respond as well. And I think that relates to the point that you just made, which is that the bigger an ecosystem gets, the more ingrained in existing systems it becomes, the more prevailing attitudes, personalities, ways of being become a part of it. And so it's like, as climate tech becomes merged with the broader global economy, which in my view, that's what we're doing. We're transforming the entire global economy over a century or something like that to be something that can last forever from a sustainability standpoint. As you do that, you bring in all players. All players come to the table. But from where we are right now, we have maximum incentive alignment. It's like, make the world last. It's the maximum incentive alignment. But I think it's a really important and beautiful statement to say, I understand how these things go, and I am working actively to appreciate it for what it is right now. Like, that's not to be underestimated as a skill and a way of being. And I just want to honor that and say it out loud, because I think so often as builders, we anticipate. It's like, okay, yeah, anticipate, but also enjoy now.
I'm glad you called that out. And that's cool to reflect on. That's not the native Sophie operating manual, which is to kind of just breeze through and move on to the next thing. And so I'm working on that. So thanks for calling that part out. It's dorky and it's super cliche, right? But this whole thing of you have to be sustainable or something in order to do sustainability work. I don't think that's totally true. I'm trying to live a really full and big and impactful life, and I'm not optimizing for balance. Don't think that exists. Yeah, that's not my priority, but it is certainly nice to be able to actively choose to stop and reflect and to call it for what it is, to have the awareness. Okay, maybe that's more it. To have the awareness to be able to reflect and to have the choice to stop and kind of call it how it is. That's something I'm going for.
Yeah, no, I love that. The way, I wrote it down here as I think about it in terms of well-being, and I see the parts of your work you talk about, which is almost certainly a fraction of the work you're actually doing. And I think, okay, here is a person doing so many different threads of work, both on behalf of this, if we want to call it a movement or a cause, or this higher level impact thing we're trying to make happen, in alignment with what you want for yourself, obviously, right?
Yeah.
You call that out all the time. It's in my interest to do this work. And so balance is a silly thing to even say in all of that. But a sense of well-being still matters. You need to be in alignment with yourself and your natural rhythms and your natural energy. And so I do wonder, what does that mean to you? What is well-being, and how are you seeking that in addition to all of the effort you put into your work?
I like the alignment sentiment. To me, that means that taking action has less friction, and therefore you can be more active and you can be more productive, and it feels better, I suppose. That just goes back to incentive alignment, I suppose. But in order to align incentives, you kind of need to know what you're after in the first place.
What are you after? How would you describe what you're after?
I knew you were going to say that. Shoot. I put myself in a corner there. I tried to just move right on. What am I after? I am after, what's that quote around life's purpose is doing your work to your best capability while also having external benefit on others. I totally butchered it. I'm sure you know that quote. I think it's a Patrick O'Shaughnessy kind of quote.
Yeah.
It's some version of alignment, I suppose, which is, I think people over index on this a little bit, but the authentic self kind of concept, that matters to me. I hate the idea of not being able to be who I am incredibly transparently and authentically, and be fine with not being the perfect version of myself all of the time, but not having to kind of hide that from others or from myself. And that gives me energy back to kind of live in this state of flow, which then is self-perpetuating and kind of feeds back. And then I do my best work, and then you get validated, and then it just kind of keeps on going. Whatever the heck that is, That's what I'm going for. And honestly, I feel that like more and more, not every season, but I do feel that more and more over time. And I think that means I'm on the right track, right? I love my community. It's very much like a found family, pretty intentional with that. And it's diverse and wide and like kind of like ever evolving. I'm so lucky to have an incredible relationship with my fiance, who I see as my like deep life partner. And that underlies so much of like confidence and support and learning. The dude worked at Bridgewater for forever. So it's like life is like I constantly get given, feedback. I love that. I don't know if it's for everybody, but it works really well for us. And then I get to work around like people on the like official work, whatever front, right? Who share a lot of those same values and are kind of gunning towards some version of self-actualization themselves as well. So it's kind of like self-actualization, the like, you're interesting because you are interested. I just like can't get enough of that. And then having the ability to build actual things that live on beyond me and can grow beyond me and that kind of compound towards this concept of I'd much rather wealth create than go for cash. I'm sure most people would answer that, but I'm very okay with giving up upfront immediate kind of like cash ownership in order to kind of convert the fame and power into wealth like in the future. And then I think once you've got that wealth in the future, then hypothetically you're able to kind of like exchange that back for those other currencies as well. There's quite a lot to that statement, I understand, but I'll come up with a better catchphrase. How about that?
I like it. To me, that whole segment, maybe that question even of what are you after? I think that's what I'm after with the show, is just hearing what is it that these people that I admire and look up to and are doing what I deem important work. What is it that they're after? What drives them? Like what separates people who are out there doing things that in my view matter deeply to the broader good? What's driving them? And so for me, that exploration is actually really interesting and helpful.
Do people answer that differently? Did I have like a more selfish response to that than some folks? Because I certainly have this conversation with folks that have the same job that I do. And we miss each other on this. We might invest in the exact same things. We'd love spending time together. But when we spend hours and hours and hours and hours digging deep into like, who are you and where are you from and where are you going and why, what drives you? We come from different places. And I've always felt a bit selfish, like in my response, which is like the self-actualization component of it, of if I work towards being the best version of myself, then that can go and have impact hypothetically in a good way on the world. Versus there's certainly another cohort of folks that operate in the climate space who are not in it at all for themselves. They see themselves as a bit of a martyr. And I'm putting words in their mouth there. I recognize that. But the concept is it should only be for impact, or it should only be for the earth, or it should only be for the good of the founder. And I just genuinely don't have an example of where that's worked over the long term on the level of systemic change that we're trying to make with, solving for this climate transition. I think you gotta put your little oxygen mask on first. And you would only do that if you believe that you being the best version of yourself will then be able to go have manifold more impact and compounding impact than a short sprint, right? Where you're not caring for yourself.
I have many responses to that. And this gets a little bit into the like philosophical side of the coaching work that I do for my profession. It's like this podcast because I love it. And I love talking with people like this. My profession is talking to people about things like that. And the definition of a martyr is basically giving up one's life for a cause.
Right.
And I think that the inherent cost in that definition is reflected in the cost on the human beings who take that approach over time. I think that there is a cost paid if either in fact or in story, you believe you are doing what you're doing purely for others and not for you, because I think it reflects a self-neglect that can only maybe come from and end in pain. And I just don't think that that's sustainable.
And if you're hurting because you're being a martyr for a cause, there are people around you that have to care for you anyway, whether that's your direct family or whether that's society because you didn't I don't know, take care of yourself and you had to go to the emergency room, right? Like we don't exist in isolation. We exist in systems. That's the whole kind of point of this problem that we're up against in the first place. And so anyway, not to harp on this too much, and I'm really not trying to dig. People get motivations from all sorts of different places, and that's amazing, right? And back to the divestment kind of conversation, you need both motivation types in order to then actually kind of just pragmatically have change. But yeah.
Well, here's what I'll add to it, because I once came from that place. I deeply sacrificed myself for my team or for my company or for my whatever. And I paid a very steep price. And it took my wife, who also is great at delivering feedback to me, sitting me down and saying, we must not live like this anymore. You are not here. You are not present. You are not happy. And so you can either find a new relationship to this work, you can find a new work, or you can find a new partner, basically. I mean, it wasn't a threat, but it was like, that's how bad this has gotten from your place of, I didn't name it as martyrdom, but I would have called it service. And now what I know is that is a shadow side of a quality that can be turned into a very positive attribute and used over a much longer period of time. And so that would be my challenge to anyone who feels like they're martyring themselves on behalf of a cause, is like, there's beauty somewhere in there. And if you can unlock the other side of it, like it might last you forever, but the martyrdom won't last forever because it will kill you, metaphorically or really. So there's my little soapbox.
Not much more to add to that. Yeah. I mean, and like there's something in there, right? Of you're paraphrasing of what your wife was communicating back to you of, here are the decisions that you can make, right? Like you being a martyr is an inherently selfish choice, and that precludes the we. And hypothetically, together, the we is stronger, right?
So the fine point I'll make on this, just from my own story, and then we'll take a break and come back, and I'll give a little preface to what we're coming back to. What I had to learn in all of that was I need help. I cannot just give help. And receiving help is an act of letting go of whatever story you're telling yourself about not deserving it. So I had to believe I deserved it. And that changed the whole relationship to it. So that is an offer to anyone else who might be going through that. Maybe there's something in that for you. So we'll leave that there. We'll take a break. When we come back, I would be totally remiss if we didn't cover the early days of CTVC and then get into some other fun stuff about business and work and impact. So that's what we'll come back to, but we'll take a quick break first. Hey, it's Barrett. You've reached about the midpoint of this conversation, and while we take a little break for station identification, as they say, I want to tell you about two things. First of all, I write a newsletter every Saturday for founders and creators who are leading teams and companies to make an impact through your work. It has 3 sections in it. The first one is a mini essay from me based on my executive coaching work with founders and creators about how to lead well. It has 3 long-form essays or links from around the web that will help spark new thoughts to help you lead better. And it has 1 quote from a meaningful book that I often find myself recommending to friends and clients. All the feedback I've gotten so far is that it hits exactly on the kinds of issues that founders, CEOs, and creators are facing every day in their work. So if that sounds appealing to you, make sure to go to my website at barrettbrooks.com, and you can subscribe right at the top of the homepage. That's BARRETTBROOKS.com. The second thing I want to tell you about is that my day job, I actually do have a day job, I'm not just a podcaster yet, is as an executive coach, as I just mentioned. I work with founders of Series A startups and later, and with creators who are doing at least $1 million as a solo founder and are now thinking about growing a team. The uniting commonality between the founders and the creators I work with is that you've reached a point in your business where you know you're going to make it. Actually, you're doing quite well. And now the question is, how much do you want to scale? And what are the leadership challenges that you're going to face along the way? This work is based on both my training as a coach and in my work as an operator in growing my old company ConvertKit from $3 to $30 million in annual revenue. If you're a founder or creator who might benefit from coaching, or if you know someone who's looking for a coach, I'd love for you to check out my site and my coaching page at barrettbrooks.com/coaching. You can learn everything about how I work as a coach and also fill out a form to have an exploratory conversation if that sounds interesting to you. All right, that's all I got for you right now. There's no sponsors for the show at the moment, so consider me your sponsor. Let's get back to the conversation for the second half. So we're back, and I want to get into a little bit about business and leadership and the specific impact of your work in this second half, or a little less than second half of the conversation. And I went way back in the archives. Part of what I love about making this show is just kind of the sleuthing and the piecing together and the puzzling of like, what is this person's story? And so I went all the way back to number 1 in the CTVC archives. I thought I'd read a quote from that first issue, just because that's basically 200 issues ago at this point, something like that.
More than that, quote, it's closer to 400.
Is it 400? Oh my gosh! Wow. Okay, so it's this is Kim writing April 5th, 2020. So this is this is a month into the world shutting down, basically. Just for always remembering the context of this thing, she says, after moving to SF, I've witnessed the overflowing capital and brilliant minds driving technological innovation, all promising to make the world a better place. But day after day, I see the money and noise flowing to yet another mobile video app. How many TikToks do we need? Fortunately, it seems venture capital is gradually trickling into the climate tech space, designated a new hot space for investors in a warming planet by TechCrunch. Climate change has entered our global agenda, and it's only a matter of time before it enters mainstream investing. It was so fascinating to read that and think that was not that long ago. I mean, 4 years is in some ways a long time, especially in tech. But in other ways, the world is so different today than it was back then. Okay, so the next thing my sleuth brain wanted to do was like, wait, Sophie's not on this. Sophie was listed on so many of the early ones. And so then I started going forward in the additions to see, when does Sophie's name pop up the first time? And it was on number 3. It was still early. And when I went back and listened to podcasts, I got to hear Kim tell this story about how this was like a side project. She was starting it out of personal interest. She had her first job right out of college. And someone in compliance at the bank basically comes knocking one day and is like, hey, I don't think so. You're not putting your name on that. You can't do that. And essentially says, shut this thing down. And so now Kim has this choice. Do I shut it down? Do I write under a pseudonym? Do I find someone to partner with? And a shared mentor of y'all's, or a shared friend of y'all's, says, oh, you need to meet Sophie. And I wonder what was going on in your life at the time that you were provided this introduction, and just how that went from your angle.
That's exactly right. And thanks for reading that. Gosh, that's wild. I can't imagine us penning something like that today. Which is, you're right, it's a crazy reflection that really wasn't that long ago. What's going on in my life? It was probably the most fallow period I've ever had. I feel guilty, like even saying that out loud. But of course, without a fallow period, then I wouldn't have had the energy or interest, I guess, or space to realize that when Kim and I kind of started partnering up on this, that it immediately kind of clicked. So I was hungering down in Rhode Island, left New York City, went and stayed with some really close friends, promised them it would be 2 weeks, brought a weekender bag, stayed for 6 months. I was relaying the gravel in their half-a-mile-long driveway. I had sanded down the bottom of the boat by hand instead of using a tool because I was so bored. We had bought like 17 different types of local plants and like planted a garden. I think I trained the dog. I don't know. I was bored. Professionally, was doing a lot of those consulting projects, but I was really kind of to make money, and I was figuring out how many other people I wanted to bring aboard that, knowing that wasn't going to be a forever thing. But also, I've always dedicated a pretty large slice of time to chatting with folks that are not immediately kind of relevant, I guess, for either the consulting work I was doing at the time or helping run Kula Bio, on and on and on. And Kim fell into that grab bag of introductions. And I'm so glad that happened, right? That's like where that creative flex kind of comes from. And we were introduced by Carrie Krasinski, who is just a really close friend. So Carrie and I wrote a book together. Carrie is a really unique specimen insofar as he believes probably deeper than anyone I've ever met that the future is youth. And he dedicates his life to that. And talk about people who are like pretty selfless. I mean, he gets a kick out of it, right? So he benefits in that regard. But this guy just runs himself ragged, helping bring the next generation of mostly undergrads and grad students kind of like to the sustainability conversation. And he's been doing this for decades and decades and decades, like a long time. So I helped bring Carrie into Brown to help teach a course together, became really close friends, wrote the book together. And so we talk all the time. And he meets thousands, like that's not an exaggeration, thousands of students a year. And he met Kim through that and he connected us. I mean, there's something to that, right? Which is, honestly, it wasn't like there was an immediate like, wow, Kim and I our lives are going to change because of this introduction, or there's an obvious affinity or an obvious kind of like fitting in of skill sets. I think that Kim and my piece was like timing, massive amount of effort, youthful kind of belief that if not us, then who, and also just why not? And then we've really deeply developed a lot as individuals and as professionals and as the kind of like role that we each individually play in the community over time. And so to me, my relationship with Kim, and we talk about this all the time, is much more one of evolution rather than immediate perfect fit. And I kind of feel that way for sure about hiring as well, which is when thinking about building teams and folks that you want to spend an enormous amount of time with, I always bias much more for the slope of the line, so the trajectory, rather than the kind of individual performance or like point of that data point in time, right? So I'm always here for the slope of the line. Just feel very lucky that Kim and mine happen to coincide, and then that we've definitely augmented each other over time.
Yeah, it's interesting to me because I've been in the spot of thinking about starting something and actively looking for a partner or a co-founder or whatever, someone to collaborate with.
Yeah.
And it's one of those situations where it's really hard to do from a place of need. It's really hard to find from a place of need. And this was not that at all.
No.
This wasn't that at all.
And let's be real. If we had gone out to search, if we had each gone out to conduct a search describing backwards what Planeteer and Sightline and CTVC are today, super low odds that we would have chosen each other. And yet, like, here we are. And I've heard so many stories of that, of people that have built really big things just with, again, it's like more than the points of the line, it's the slope, right? And willingness to work incredibly hard for no reward for a ludicrously long time on it. There's a real like ethic, like work ethic kind of part to it as well, which then also means folks that have other priorities or other dependencies, that just slices out 90% of the population right there. We were healthy, safe, had enough capacity to kind of like hack it together financially, surrounded by people that thought it was like objectively cool that we were spending our time doing this. And then we just like really self-reinforced together. And then quite quickly, other folks started like chirping in who were the real deal in the community at that point in time. Other folks that wrote way bigger than us newsletters or had huge Twitter followings, on and on and on. And no one ever kind of gave us any lip in the beginning or kind of like look sideways. We're really lucky that we started this product in a super unique point in time where everyone was innately curious and had capacity and was excited to Zoom with one another, because we're all shut at home and we were bored. And so people were just like much more curious and had a higher appetite for content versus, I know it's just 4 years later, but like, dude, bazillion podcasts out there, bazillion newsletters, a ton of copycats. And so there's something to be said for it. Wasn't quite a green field, but we were definitely motivated right out of the gates.
Revisionist history is common for a reason, right? And so you're pretty clear-eyed about what it was and what it wasn't back then. Yeah. But I wonder if you remember, what was the initial commitment that you made to one another in partnering on it?
Super cut and dry up front. Kim couldn't put her name on it, so could she borrow my brand and my name for us to write together? And so that was a trade of credibility, I suppose. That might be making it sound a bit too fancy. And then just effort that we were going to team up in the work that it took to pull this thing together, which back in the day was trivial because there were like no deals to track. And the news was like 3 little snippets. And I guess the trade was a little bit of like, Kim had already set up some of the back end side of it. So like the website, and the Substack platform. And then I spent a bit more of my time in the positioning and in the making sure that we were distributing it to the right places. And that's always worked really nicely together. We found the right balance over time of making sure that credit for building CTVC together gets split appropriately down the middle. I think in that rough divvying of responsibilities, it would be really easy for Kim to be behind the scenes and for me to get all of the credit. But that's not how we built this thing. And that would have been, really goofy and really short-sighted of me to run with that. And also, it wasn't just Kim and me, right? Pretty quickly, there started to be a ton of other folks that were participating in this. And that it wouldn't have been as good as a product if there hadn't been so many voices and perspectives and audiences kind of like involved in this who sat all across the globe, literally, different ages, different interest areas, and contributed back to it. And so that was why it was really essential for us to build for the brand rather than build for the individuals underneath it.
Yeah. That makes sense to me. And the team, the business, well, it wasn't a business. It's become a business. It's become multiple businesses now. There's a team. There's so much more there today. Also, shout out to Grace Donnelly, who is a University of Georgia grad, which is where I went to school. So
nice.
Very proud of that. Was fun to see her get hired. It grew into something that had you all been, again, to hammer the point home, trying to found something together, it would not have become. And I think I've heard you say that same thing. There's just no way you could have anticipated how the dominoes would fall looking forward as compared to how they have worked out now.
To make that even more explicit, not to name names, but there were a ton of folks that tried to build a business out of doing objectively the same product. They're not running that business anymore.
Yeah.
And I think I've described it this way publicly quite a few times, but needed to believe that by building for a long time and developing that like consistency and quality and therefore higher kind of subscriber base and engagement levels, that from that, only once you've reached that point would you be able to see the actual most interesting business opportunities on the back end of that. We wouldn't have seen the data platform or kind of like the fund opportunity at the level that we came out of the gates with both of those things early on. And so it made sense to just like keep grinding at it.
Yeah, there's so much there. That's also easy to forget as you get more resourced, and I'm, every time I say that, it's like I'm talking about myself. As I am more resourced, it's easy to forget that the work of this show, as an example, is the work of doing 250 episodes before I think anything about what it means to me. And that applies almost everywhere where you're putting effort into something that matters to you and don't yet know what the outcome is going to be. I mean, whether it's building a startup or building a media platform or anything else. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about climate in particular because I care deeply about this. I worked in a climate tech startup for a little while that has de-stealthed now, which is fun. I can finally name where I worked, which is Panthalassa. So they at least have a website,
you
panthalassa.com. Yep.
Hey, I'm a tiny angel investor from when it was called like 3 names before that.
Yep. So very grateful to be able to kind of like slowly start to pump them up, although it's still on a slow grind. So all I'll say now is that they have a website and you should go check it out because if it works, it's going to be an incredible addition to what's going on right now. But I want to talk a little bit about the sector. So you all have done a wonderful job of defining climate tech. In many ways, like for the whole ecosystem, there's different ways of going about it. And certainly there's many sources, but you all have created a very helpful map. And this is not a climate show. This is a show about doing important work and using our careers to have leverage for impact in the world while still making a healthy living. And so I wonder if you could just kind of define that map as one of y'all's original kind of concepts that obviously builds on others so that people kind of understand what is climate tech. Because in my view, climate tech is the effort to reinvent everything in a sustainable way, but we need a mental model for that in the short term.
I'll share our mental model. It's less a definition so much as it is a framework. And so the framework kind of goes like this, which is climate tech is not an industry, it's a theme, and it most directly impacts these 7 sectors. And we define those 7 sectors as energy, transportation, food and land use, built environment, industrials, climate intelligence, and carbon. Interestingly, carbon we added on later. And so over time, these sub-technology areas, think hydrogen, of which underneath that technology area, we have multiple sub-tech categories. Think electrolyzers, think PEM electrolyzers. It actually goes quite nuanced. That's where those kind of tech areas like bubble up into those kind of sector areas. But that's not enough, right? It's not just technologies. For example, you could have a technology, let's take some version of a battery, right, which is not applied to a climate context. And so then we have these kind of like application layers, which are filtering mechanisms for us defining the universe of whether a company counts as a climate tech business or not. And so those filtering layers, it was pretty obvious. The first one should be mitigation. It's kind of where climate, clean tech like came from. Over time, we've expanded out a bit from there. So rather than just reducing future emissions or kind of current emissions, we also count removals, right? So that's kind of most directly impacts the carbon vertical, but it actually goes across some of those other sectoral areas as well. We certainly have a large one, which is adaptation. Sadly, interestingly, whatever descriptor you want to add onto it, that's been our fastest growing application layer. And that will almost certainly continue to do so. Most directly impacts kind of the climate intelligence and built environment like sectors. And we also have regenerative as a layer. And then there's like just a broader kind of enablers layer. We need maybe a better name for that. But those are, some of these applications can be climate technologies, but they're not directly doing mitigation or doing carbon drawdown or whatnot themselves. And so we kind of see those as some of the enabling application layers. So that's the highest level of it. There's a really beautiful Marimekko chart, which is probably my favorite of the many thousands that we like have ever made, that lays out in my version of a market map of all of the tech areas and kind of how they split out. Just from the Mekko, you can see some really interesting things around, wow, crazy. I didn't realize that, food and land use was the third largest vertical from like a dollars deployed perspective. Or, oh, that's so interesting. Nuclear has a tiny count of companies, but has a massive proportionate dollar amount that's been invested into that vertical, right? And so with the Mekko, you can kind of see the whole world and then realize that maybe your narrative or kind of your perspective within it is either validated and shared by the actual dollars flowing through, or you're kind of, living in a little niche within it. So shout out to the Marimekko.
There you go. I love it. And just this sectoral kind of breakdown is also mapped on top of y'all's funding updates or CTVC's funding updates that you do. And I just love that nuanced kind of matrixed approach. It's such a consultant thing to do, of course, right? Which is like define the sector and the different layers of it and the ways you can chop it up and then look at the data in the different ways. And one of the outputs of that, or one of the things I've taken away from hearing you talk about it and reading it, is the kind of underfunded, overfunded areas of technology relative to emissions, especially. And if I'm a founder thinking, and I may be in the future, I was thinking about it in the past, I am thinking, where are the underfunded, overrepresented in emissions stuff that we need to tackle still? Where are the hard problems we haven't tackled? This is not emissions related, but I think about the adjacent problem of what are we going to do with all of the micro and nanoplastics in the world that exist and that are entering our bodies? And is there going to be an enzymatic type solution that we take orally that solves it for us? Is there going to be filtering that, it's like, if you're thinking about founding something again, that's an interesting view through which to approach that problem of what should I start? But the other view is the stages that companies are entering. And you talk a little bit about kind of these cohorts or vintages of companies as they come through. And there is a certain vintage of company that's a fairly wide cohort that's now hitting the stage of kind of commercialization, manufacturing. This was a thing that I was thinking a lot about in some of my past roles, is what happens when we go from it works to we need 10,000 of them? And how do we position ourselves? How do we go to market? How do we transport energy or product or whatever? And that set of business challenges is fascinating. And so I tee all of that up to say, what do you foresee being the big challenges that are coming for that cohort or vintage of companies? And what do you think is maybe underappreciated by those founders right now in terms of the problems that they're going to have to overcome?
By the founders who are thinking about kind of progressing through the various stages and maturation of the capital stack. I think founders underappreciate that it is an expected core competency of them to essentially be strategic financial professionals. The reason that that's necessary in climate in particular, relative to other less capital intensive or just where there's less opportunity to raise any alternative types of funding, is, of course, it's both a requirement, but it's also a massive take-home equity opportunity upside for those founders to harness and leverage and deeply understand the other levers of the capital stack that are less well represented in other sectors. So, for example, pretty rare that the DOE would put out massive, non-dilutive kind of grants for, I have no idea,
TikTok,
crypto,
to use the original newsletter.
NFT, whatever. Yeah, 100%. Relative to, these are often national security issues, and there's good reason for less dilutive funding to be flowing into the space. That's one side. It's pretty obvious. Corporates have often serious concerns over how they're going to very rapidly pivot, augment, slightly tweak their business models to solve for these emerging challenge areas. All right, great. That means maybe they're want to be a customer, but it also means maybe they're open to more creative things like non-invasive joint ventures, doing offtake agreements, right? And kind of advanced market commitment concepts from a purchasing perspective. Also means that there's venture debt coming from different places into the ecosystem. There's early infrastructure funding, which is an entirely new, I'd say, kind of asset class, which is emerging as we speak. I think first of a kind facility financing is going to be the hot topic of this year, though I think very few will figure out how to actually leverage it. In any case, that's a whole smattering of different slices of what we call the climate capital stack, all of which a founder and her team need to leverage and understand and work towards very early in order to bridge the innovation to deployment gap. There's this term out there, it's more, people have written many books on this, around the climate tech valleys of death, which essentially means that products, that technologies, that companies get stuck. They can't bridge the valley, and therefore they die, which is the dramatic part about it. And that's often it ultimately kind of comes down to financing. There's derivative implications of that. It's an existential need for founders. I also see it as a massive opportunity upside, is the positive angle to it. And that's an area that Planeteer Capital, my early stage venture fund, leans in explicitly, early, and incredibly enthusiastically to support founders with in aligning their commercial and their engineering strategy with their capitalization strategy. It's different. You cannot just raise venture equity to go all the way through to deployment in climate. And you'll regret doing that because you will own less of your business, even if it ends up being a great outcome on the other side.
Yeah. If you own any of it at all to speak of, it's like at some point you dilute yourself to the point of incentive misalignment. And that's a real 100%. Problem that should be avoided. One of the implications of this, of course, that you've talked about publicly is there is a recycling of talent and capital coming in this, because for every company that bridges that valley, there's going to be 10 or 20 or 25 that don't. And so there's going to be this interesting new thing happening where we had a bunch of experienced tech talent or whatever, any kind of talent coming into climate for the first time. And now we're going to have experienced operators and talent with experience in climate tech getting recycled back to the beginning of the cycle. I would never say this to the founder or the team going through shutting a company down. It's because it's like right after you break up with someone you've been with for a long time in a personal relationship, you're not like, oh, everything's going to be great though. This is a positive. However, at the system level, it will be a positive because you end up with experienced operators and people coming back around to say, okay, I've got the lessons. I understand the game. It's always been an odds game. Let me get back after it on something new this time. I kind of took your line there. But anyways, all of that to say, you talk about that and I agree with it. And in some ways, I'm excited for it. We're nearing the end of our time together. And so one of the things that I really wanted to ask you before I get to my kind of wrap up questions is on Ben Yao's podcast. You said a thing that so deeply resonated with me that I just had to reflect back to you. And you said that your intent is to anchor in excellence and an impact to the ecosystem, that those are kind of like bars that you hold for yourself or standards that you hold for yourself, this kind of excellence and impact thing. And so I wanted to ask you about each of those. How do you define excellence for yourself? And if you have the impact that you hope that you will, what do you think that will look like over time? Just a little light fodder here for the end of our conversation.
Yeah, no kidding. How do I think about excellence for myself? Maybe we can warm up to this one. I mean, I think about it like excellence in writing is often if someone else has the capability or has already said it, that is not excellent. You should probably not say it that way ever again because other people can do it that way. What's a better way? What's a way that only you can write that sentence or help folks see that future? I try really hard to pull that sentiment through CTVC. Otherwise, you end up with tropes and quips and metaphors that are overused. And I think that does a disservice to the reader. So I guess that's kind of excellence in writing. Maybe to pull that metaphor through to kind of broader, it's living at that edge of what only I can do that is just as good, if not kind of like equivalent to what I see as the bar that's already out there. So it's like, say it differently, but build on it and do it better. That varies dramatically between actions, whether that's like helping someone else on your team be the most excellent version of themselves, whether that's producing a work product, whether that's achieving a milestone. I don't know. I think it all kind of comes back to that self-actualization component and recognizing that your own bar for excellence or for that kind of like output will continue to hopefully, I mean, this is definitely how I live my life, but hopefully only kind of continue to accelerate and increase over time.
I would venture to say that both the scary part and the opportunity about setting your own standard is that if we're really honest with ourselves, even when we value having a trainer, a coach, a mentor, a partner, even as hard as they could push us, they don't know what we're capable of the way we do.
Yeah, absolutely not.
We know.
And like, yeah, and it's like only up to you to set the bar. But let's run with that kind of like trainer or coach or whatever example. As soon as I meet that person, if I have something to learn from them, they're now the bar, right? And so the bar only continues to increase with exposure. I work out at a gym where it's almost all extremely fit 30-year-old men. And there's like 10% women. And one of the trainers said to me, wow, you're probably the woman in the gym that can lift the most weight. That had never crossed my mind because I'm not comparing myself to the women. I'm comparing myself to all the people in the gym. And so my sights are set on, the dude who's probably physically much more prone to be able to lift more weight than I am. But I didn't even think twice about that. I actually thought it was quite odd that person said that to me. And same with exposure. But the world is a big place. The internet is even larger. It's impossible that you will ever be the best. And you're probably going to live a really crappy life if you are optimizing to be the best in one tiny little niche. I've always had a pretty tough time with naming heroes. Really don't think, if you held a gun to my head or forced me to make a decision like right now, that I would swap out my life for really anybody else's. Come back to me on that one, but I'm having a tough time with it because you've got to trade the whole thing. And like comparison is tricky. You can slice and dice and stuff and people will be like spiky on certain metrics, but to take the whole package is entirely different. And so I think over time, to that point of like excellence, I've come to think about that as I'm probably always going to hold myself to that bar of like the person in the gym or like anybody that you're exposed to on that one metric, be it lifting the weights in this goofy scenario or writing a Substack or understanding climate science or performance for a venture fund, like these metrics that I care about, I'm always going to be aware of kind of like where the bar is, which only continues to increase. But I'm also like feeling over time much more confident in myself as a holistic performer across all of those metrics that I care about and realizing that really no one else cares about that same assortment. And isn't that amazing? That's becoming the kind of like self-actualized person and having the chance to get to choose and to be aware of the fact that you are choosing your own metrics is, maybe the most excellent of it all.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. It resonates so much. Exactly why I wanted to ask you about that quote from that interview. For me, it's like on this project, there are probably 10,000 interview shows in the world, and it's going to be difficult to get attention. And so why would I set my bar anywhere other than the very best interviewers I've ever heard and my expectation for myself? I don't anticipate I can do that immediately, but over several hundred conversations with very smart people, it should absolutely be possible that I could be one of the best interviewers in the world. Why would it not? Or else I'm mailing it in and I might as well not do it.
Yep, totally. And you can learn from those best in class people. The internet, an amazing thing. There's no excuse to not know just as much information as anybody else that has access to the internet, right? And so if this is your priority and you're hot on their heels and you're compounding and you're doing this for long enough, good odds that current best in class person will get distracted or prioritize something else, and you can go usurp them if you really care about taking the title right at that point. So when we started CTVC, we always valued excellence, right? Quality and consistency over time. There were 30 other climate tech newsletters or podcasts that were on our kind of comparison list, not competitor list, like comparison list. And there's like 2 of those that are still standing. And so you play a long enough game, you align the incentives right.
4 years.
You can go win whatever race you want to win. Yeah.
I love it. Well, I'm going to pair. So I always ask the same 3 questions to end. I'm going to pair the second half of what I asked you before with the last question. So I'll ask you the last 3 that I always ask. The first one is, almost every time I'm interviewed, there's some question I wish that they would have asked me that's like what I actually care about right now. And so that's my first question for you is, what is it that you really deeply care about right now that you'd like to be able to talk about that I didn't ask you about?
I think I'm thinking a lot about the next platform build for me. I've been running with the CTVC platform as backbone for a long time. I'm proud of layering in Planeteer, which folks will start to hear a whole lot more about over the next little bit. But even now, I'm thinking about the firm being much more than just our current product and the kind of rinse and repeat of our current product and what needs to be true in order for that to happen now, not when that becomes kind of like crucial in the future. And so it's this sense of relevancy immediately, and how do you enable that kind of for the long term? What's the next set of tools and flywheels and networks that I can enable now, or kind of like at least get started with now, that will kind of continue to perpetuate Planeteer as a platform rather than a product? And I think that means like really building out the team and folks around me. And I'm not certain in what direction I want that to go or that should go at the moment, which is, makes me nervous, but also is probably one of the most exciting things. I really care about building those like teams and communities that work really well together. So that's like major thing I'm thinking about, even though I probably should be thinking about just like the things that are directly right in front of me, because that's a long list. It's a really long list as well. And so like along with that, right, comes I can't do this all alone and I don't want to do this all alone. And so there have always been partners in everything that I've built. And Kim and my partnership is super strong and continues to enable both of us. We now have these products that we're working on, which kind of are a bit of an overlapping platform. Just thinking about like, what's that next kind of 10 years partnership journey going to look like? And how do I structure that correctly and make this a place that folks want to come and kind of like build on top of and alongside, while being very conscious that there's a lot of other funds, there's a lot of other investment firms like out there in the space now. It's become crowded, which is lovely. So it's just kind of like relevancy for the super duper long term, I think is what I've been thinking about a lot. That's great. Okay, last 2. There's this quote in this memoir. My listeners are going to get so tired of me explaining this, but for every guest, I need to explain it a little bit. So there's this quote in this memoir I read, and it's stuck with me so hard ever since I read it. It was talking about a young woman imagining a future that was so much better than her past. And the phrase was, it was either an unbearably beautiful future or an unspeakably beautiful future. But I like it as unbearably beautiful future. And I think so much of what you do is based in hope and optimism and initiating change so that the future will be better. And so I wonder, when I share that phrase of unbearably beautiful future, what would make that the case 30, 50, 100 years from now if what you're doing works out the way you hope it will? I don't know if that one resonates with me as much as it does with you, honestly. The like unbearably or unspeakably, that makes it feel like intangible or like painful, I guess, like even to like behold. I get excited about a future in which this concept of there being like pollution in the atmosphere, right? Or not enough resources to use, or that usage not being evenly distributed and kind of like equitable or fair. I get excited about thinking about a future where we're so past that that we don't think about any of that kind of resource usage or lack of access as a pain point, and we're on to like even further up Maslow's hierarchy of needs of like everybody gets to kind of go self-actualize. Maybe that's beautiful, but I think that's just practical. So I guess I get excited
What's interesting
about
to me about that is I think for a climate doomer, they're so common these days, that would be unbearably beautiful. It's like they can't even behold it because it would challenge everything that they believe about what's happening. And that's why I appreciate this side of the ecosystem so much, is that it's easy to get discouraged. It's easy to like be like, oh man, are we in trouble? Or it could be easy. I don't find myself there that often, but the builders are who are going to make that not the case.
Yeah.
And so to me, that's exactly, that fits the bill perfectly.
I mean, I think it's attainable, right? Otherwise I wouldn't be going and doing this. If I did not think that we could attain it deeply, then it's all kind of futile. Just go YOLO. But I think we can get there. And so it's more practical of, I see the future. I'm excited to get to it. It's not unspeakable. I like talk and think and try to articulate the future all the time.
I like that. I like the challenging of the idea. I appreciate that. Okay. My last one is, who are you becoming as a leader, as a business person, as a thinker? Who are you becoming right now?
I can't tell you who. I can tell you some of the characteristics of like what, or like a better version of myself. I am becoming more resilient. Case in point, I don't crash as much as I used to. So I used to be able to sprint, but then what people wouldn't see is like periods of time where I'd have to kind of like lie fallow or like recover. I decided I didn't want to live like that, made some kind of like hard adjustments around that, and I don't crash anymore, which is amazing. I'm proud of myself for that. So that's kind of, I'm becoming more resilient over time. That will make me by far a better producer, leader, whatever, boss, on and on and on, investment performer. I'm leaning into my convictions. I think I'm a highly convicted person in the first place. And I think that's kind of what I'm in business to do. I'm not going to be right all of the time, but if I don't have conviction, then I've got nothing. And so figuring out those unlocks for feeling more in kind of like flow state around that is going to be self-perpetuating. So I'm leaning in pretty hard on that. Simultaneously, kind of maybe in an enabling fashion, in order to do that, I've got to be more protective and kind of like ruthless of some version of like my time or myself or whatnot. You can only get so efficient and you can only enable these things. You've got to say no a whole bunch more. That's tough for everybody. That's really, really hard for me. I love those magical moments of serendipity and that kind of like curiosity component to it. But I've had to say no a ton more over the past, couple of years. And that's only going to kind of like exponentially increase. So that's kind of working on that part. And then I want to have the capacity myself to be able to then kind of like give back in different ways, like ways that probably will ultimately result in like going and starting a family, or at least getting a dog and getting started in that capacity. And I haven't felt the desire for that version of kind of like building and giving before. That's like a different type of giving. It's kind of more of like a selfless type of giving. And so I can feel that coming, I suppose, for the future.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you. That's what I've got for our episode, and I'm really grateful to you. I know it doesn't come at a small cost to spend 2 hours together, but I'm really hopeful that this conversation and your way of seeing the world will encourage more people to take action generally, to get into climate specifically, and to know that forward movement and the standard of excellence that you hold yourself to is one way to make a huge difference. And I anticipate, the difference you've already made has been massive. And I anticipate it's going to be a small fraction of what happens over the course of the rest of your career. So I'll be rooting for you. And of course, always here to support. So thanks for spending time with me.
Thank you. Back to the point of all of this being incentive aligned. I certainly am an external processor, and there's no chance I would have done this much introspection or thinking or even reflecting on times where I've said other things on the internet, right, relative to now. So thank you for helping me bookmark this moment. That was real treat. Thank you.
That's awesome. Thanks for listening to this episode of Good Work. This podcast is made by me, Barrett Brooks, and is produced by my friends over at Podcast Royale. If you enjoyed this episode, please make sure to hit that subscribe or follow button wherever you get your podcast. Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube. I'd love for you to follow along there. My guest today was Sophie Purdom. You can find her work at planeteercapital.com, the publication at CTVC.co, and as with many of my guests, Sophie's a great follow on Twitter. As always, you can find all of the summary takeaways of the show, notes, quotes, clips, and links from the show at goodworkshow.com. All of the past episodes and show notes can be found there as well. So make sure to check out goodworkshow.com for more. If you enjoyed today's episode, please make sure to leave us a review. Reviews help more people find the show, whether it's on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or even just leaving a comment on YouTube. The algorithms love reviews and comments because it shows engagement. It shows people really care. So I'd be really grateful if you would go do that for me. If you're just feeling like you want something quick, I'd love it if you'd take today's show, drop it in a link, and share it with one friend who you think would love it. Sophie's super interesting and has a relatable story, so please think of someone that you know that could enjoy it and send it their way one-to-one. On next week's show, you can expect to hear from someone named Packy McCormick. Packy runs a publication called Not Boring and a fund called Not Boring Capital. If you're in the tech or startup worlds, you probably heard of Packy, but if you're not, I think you're going to love hearing his story about how he's built a relatively big empire from what started as single essays about tech companies he was fascinated in. He's got a great story, and he's got unique insight on how tech as an industry is growing and what's on the frontier edges of that industry. As always, thanks for tuning in. I'm grateful for your attention. I know it's not nothing to listen to 2 hours of a conversation on a deep topic like climate change and climate tech. So I'm grateful for you, and I look forward to seeing you on the next episode.